today we're going to focus on the co-registration part, specifically for the 2024 deadline, so end of this year deadline, albeit much of the information we're going to go through today also applies to all the other registration deadlines. So I'm sure you will get a lot of information out of this, learnings out of this webinar. So this is a part 2 webinar specifically on K-Reach and registration for the registration deadline coming later this year. So the first part 1, which talked about the lead registration aspects, we already had on the 6th of March. So if you want to have a look at that, just go to YouTube, to our YouTube channel, REACHLaw Talks, and you will find it there. So today it'll be part 2, and as said, focusing on the co-registration activities for the deadline this year. And we, as presenters, we have the usual suspects. So Gagan Kumar and myself. And Gagan, please, if you introduce yourself for the good folks who haven't seen us before.
Thank you, Frederik. So, and also on behalf of REACHLaw, I'll welcome all the participants joining this session. And myself, Gagan Kumar, I'm based out of New Delhi. I also work as director of REACHLaw India Private Limited, which is subsidiary to REACHLaw Finland. And I've been working in these regulations, REACH or REACH-like regulations. That's also my interest since 2008. So, and I'm happy to help and support companies who are looking for compliance-related requirements, also for Korea. So, thank you again.
Thank you, Gagan. And I'm Frederik Johanson, partner, head of sales at REACHLaw. Been working on REACH and REACH-like chemical regulations for a long time, 20 years coming up actually this year. So that's a long time. But now, as of late, focusing a lot on K-Reach, obviously, and that will be the subject of today. So happy to be here guiding you through the hoops. So some practical information regarding the webinar. So it'll be interactive in the sense that you can send out questions using the chat functions. And of course, we've received some questions ahead of time. So we'll go through those at the end during the Q&A session. And of course, please feel free to send us comments and feedback on this content. We'll be happy to accommodate, and of course, always take up suggestions how to make things even better. So thank you very much. So if you look at the agenda, so as per usual, we will have a quick look at REACHLaw for those of you who don't know us. Then we'll also have a look at the quick basics of the K-Reach regulation. And if you want to have a more in-depth run through of the basics, then I invite you to have a look at this part 1 webinar, and even the earlier webinar we had at the end of the year, where we really went into the basics of the K-Reach regulation. It's available on REACHLaw Talks, so you can have a look at that. So on YouTube, that is. Then we'll look at the registration efforts for existing substances. So this is a bit of a recap also, albeit a bit more focus on co-registration, before then heading over to the actual co-registration process. So how to get access to data and work together in the CICO and submit your dossier and so forth. Then we'll conclude with an action plan for co-registrants for the 2024 deadline, which is end of this year, 31st of December, for 100 to 1,000 ton substances, and then conclude before then finalizing with the Q&A part. And as usually, I think this will go over 1 hour. So sorry for that in advance, but as said, you will find this webinar also on YouTube on REACHLaw Talks. So if you will not have time to, or you have to leave earlier. Okay, so just a quick run through of REACHLaw, the basics. So what we do, so we provide support for REACH and REACH-like chemical regulations, and obviously this is also now encompassing the K-Reach regulation. But we also work in Korea for K-OSHA, so the regulation governing safety data sheets, or material safety data sheets, as they are called in Korea. We'll talk about that in just a second. So other than K-REACH, of course, EU REACH, KKDIK in Turkey, and of course UK REACH is something that we are working on, and also can provide only representative services because we have offices in these countries. And then for India BIS is something that is, we will not go into details here, but it is something that is growing and becoming more prominent, and something that we also support through our office in India. So we really provide the full set of services for your chemical products to get market access to these different jurisdictions we looked at, and we can also service other jurisdictions through our partner network. But our main services are indeed providing only representative services for chemical products, substances as such or part of mixtures, and of course taking care of all the regulatory dossiers such as registrations, pre-registrations, doing notifications, CLP notification, etc. for our customers. And this also encompasses the more demanding work such as lead registrations, authorizations, and restriction consultations, for example, providing feedback on those consultations, and much more. But if we look at specifically Korea, South Korea, then just to make it clear, so we have an office, a subsidiary in South Korea. We have people there. Again, as due to the time, it is I think it is 9 o'clock in Korea, so that is why Gagan and myself are having this presentation. But one of these days we'll absolutely force them to also stay up a bit later on to be part of this webinar. But for the time being, it is Gagan and myself. And Gagan has been working with K-REACH a lot for his customers in India, for example. So he's very well versed on that. And that's why he's my co-host here today. So we have an office in Seoul, and through this office we provide the full set of services that are required to comply with, excuse me, comply with K-REACH, for example. So being an only representative, submitting late pre-registrations where applicable, co-registrations, which will be the topic today, lead registrations, which was the topic of last webinar, and so forth. Managing the CICO, being this so-called representative consulting company that we'll discuss a bit more, and all the related activities. Then for K-OSHA, so that is the regulation governing, in this specific context, the safety data sheets, material safety data sheets as they're called. So we do authoring. We can also function as an only representative for K-OSHA purposes, MSDS purposes. This is a very unique concept for Korea, and do all the work related there. Submit these dossiers to the ministry, and also all the related work, and apply, for example, for CBI protection, which is quite common. So all in all, we try to demystify K-REACH as much as possible in this webinar series and the previous webinars also. So that's our mission in, well, not in life, but in work life for the moment. So as mentioned, we do have a YouTube channel called REACHLaw Talks where we post these webinars. So we already have a fairly handsome amount of webinars on all kinds of topics such as KKDIK, but also, of course, Korea REACH and UK REACH and so forth. So please head over to REACHLaw Talks and have a look. And if you like it, you can always subscribe and put on the notifications, then we'll get notified when we post new content there, such as this webinar. So we also just like to note that you can meet us in these different events. I will not go through them all. There's some events in India, in Helsinki, here in Helsinki, back in India, Chem UK in the UK, of course, ChemCon Asia in Bangkok, ChemSpec in Germany, and then TurkChem in Istanbul. So we'll be in all of these events in person. So if you are there, please come by our booth and say hello. We'd love to chat with you, of course. So what's happening now? I will actually, in the interest of time, just mention that just very quickly that Ukraine REACH is something that is we're following very closely, because we got a lot of questions about that, and that is something that they still have on the how do you say roadmap for this year. Albeit I'm a bit skeptical whether that will happen in practice, but it's still there. So it's something that we will be providing a webinar on fairly shortly. And I also invite you to have a look at India BIS related topics on our YouTube channel, for example, because that is something that for many people is flying a bit under the radar. But for the other chemical regulations, not including India REACH, because that's not happening at the moment. Turkey is very active. UK, despite the postponements of the registration deadlines in Turkey, it's quite active actually. UK is still waiting for this alternative registration model, meaning the registration process is a bit changing, so we will know more on that later on. And EU REACH, of course, we're waiting for this REACH 2.0, so the REACH review, but that is postponed a bit due to the Commission changing and so forth. So that's the 5 cents on these global regulations. And of course, today we'll talk about K-REACH in more detail. So the customary disclaimer, copyright. So any action you may take based on this presentation is, of course, your own responsibility and risk. So we will not provide any representations or warranties regarding the accuracy of this information or completeness of the information in this presentation. So if you want to have proper advice, then please contact us separately, and we can provide specific information to your case and so on. But nonetheless, I think this is a good edutainment, if nothing else. Okay, in the interest of saving a bit of bandwidth, I will just turn off the camera and hand over the quick basics of K-REACH to Gagan. Please tell me when to change slides.
Yes, thank you. So I will, of course, talk about K-REACH quick basics and also the registration of existing substances, which is next chapter of this presentation. So next slide, please. So on the K-REACH, I think the important information which is on this slide is that this regulation is already in force since January 2015 and has gone through several amendments during this phase. We are now in 2024 already, and the regulation, the body which is managing this regulation is Korean Ministry of Environment, Ministry MOE, and there are several other authorities which are responsible for different handling of the submissions and other procedures under the chemical management. So it's just not one entity, but there are more authorities, and there are also to update that there are substances which are prioritized already in July by the Ministry of Environment, and these substances are around 510. These are available, and also if you happen to manufacture or want to enter Korea with these substances, you need to apply direct registration. So there is a previous deadline, which is 30th of June 2018 has already passed. And in all the regulations, when you have deadlines and you are trying to sell it after the deadline, then you need to get registration before you can access the market. So these substances, essentially you need registration. And then, as I mentioned, the amendment also takes this into consideration that the companies can do this pre-registration also in Korea. And this K-REACH allows companies to provide some basic information on your substances and also the importer information and some other details that will give you a transitional period to register. So that is why this is common for existing substances. And as Frederik mentioned, that we have quite detailed webinar on 12th of December, and this you will find in our YouTube channel. So I would recommend companies to go through this webinar, which will give you more information. What are the existing substances? How you identify your inventory for K-REACH? and that would go for immediate registration, or there you can have a transitional registration scheme, meaning that those are existing substances. So that's very helpful webinar, and have practical information so you can do something after the webinar. And this of course the scope is similar to EU REACH. So if you have more than 1,000 kilos entering into Korea, you would require registration to sell into Korea after the deadline. And since most of the companies that we received are manufacturing chemicals outside Korea, so you can have a similar decision making, that you can have a direct access to Korea by appointing a representative, and this representative has to be a South Korean entity that will help you throughout the procedure of your application, getting registration, maintaining those registrations, and all kind of regulatory compliances. So this is, for example, REACHLaw Korea Limited can assist you with and you will have control on your registration. You are not dependent on importer registration, and you are free to develop your customers in South Korea. Next slide, please. So this is how the market access requirements are defined in the legal text. The important is this existing substances, which I mentioned. And essentially these are manufactured or imported in South Korea already, which are more than 1 ton per annum. And you can those apply for late fee registration or notification. And then you have a deadline for, based on the quantities you sell to South Korea, you have a deadlines defined by this quantity, which we will see later in the slides. And the substances which are not existing substances would eventually fall into the new substance category. And you will also in this webinar of December, you can see how you define these new substances. So which are not existing will be termed as new substances, and these are meaning that you need to, since it's a new to South Korea, they would require information prior to placing these substances into South Korean market, and you need to apply for registration. The quantities, of course, there is a change. As you see, it's still 100 kilos or more, and then if you are selling more, less than 100 kilos or more, there are I think simpler notification, but more than 100 kilos or more, it requires registration. And that quantity of 100 kgs will be replaced by 1,000 kilos or 1 ton. This will apply from next year, January 2025, as K-REACH Act was amended recently in February, which defines these changes, which will be implemented from next year. Next slide, please. And these are some of the definitions which are we are using quite often in the later part of presentation. So existing substances are phase-in substances. Phase-in is a quite known term if you are already working in European and you have been registering under European REACH, then these are the common terms. So this is also similar that you have in South Korea, that the K-REACH defines this as existing substances, and they have a unique KE number that will, of course, is the identity of the substance to be an existing substance, and then this priority existing substances known as PEC are also existing chemicals, but then these you will not get access to the market without registration. And there are 4 tonnage bands. So we will see also in the next slides that how these deadlines are defined on these tonnage bands. And the new substances we termed as non-phase-in substances, which are not an existing substance. So everything which is not existing will be a new substance. And then KE number is a kind of number defined in this Korean inventory, which is having a unique number for each cache number, and it's a linked how it is linked is to this cache number. And then you will see this through this IT system and demonstration that we had in this December webinar. And National Institute of Environment is the body which is authority which is also looking into your dossiers and making some recommendations, which you will see in the later part of the slide. And CICO is also important term that we have explained in the part 1 webinar more in detail, but we will also explain how it influenced the co-registration process, and it's also termed as Chemical Substance Information Communicative Organization. This is similar to CIF, Substance Information Exchange Forum of EU REACH. So it's to assist companies to make a joint registration. Next slide, please. So here are some of the important comparison. I think comparison gives you more idea on what are the changes you are seeing in Korea, K-REACH, than EU REACH. So only representative is there, so you can have a direct access to the market by appointing some only representative in South Korea. But then you need an approval from authority. So there is a step with the authority that you need for an OR appointment approval before you can go ahead with the pre-registration and registration. Then pre-registrations and registrations are similar process, but for registration, as I mentioned earlier, there is a registration for existing substances, and then there are new substances where you also require registrations and simpler notification if it is below 100 kilos. And this 100 kilos, as I mentioned, will be changed to 1 ton from January next year. Polymers in Korea, we will of course cover this, and Frederik will also inform you about what we will bring as a company to the audience, that how polymers are handled in Korea is that they would eventually require a registration if they doesn't meet this non-polymer low concern criteria. So that is something which is important. If it is not meeting this criteria, they will require to be registered as polymer. Whereas in Europe it is completely different, but of course there are discussions which bring certain polymers to be registered in EU also. Then exemptions in South Korea, usually you have 2 types of exemption. One is of course a self-declaration, like you have in European REACH, which is reviewed of course during inspections. But in Korea, you have self-declaration as well as exemptions which you need to obtain from authority. So you need to apply for an exemption from the authority, and then they will review your application with some, of course, they require some set of forms that you have to fill out and then provide certain additional information that we will of course cover later, not in this webinar, but you need to get this exemption approved before you sell your products to South Korea. Registration data requirements, it's similar, that more quantities would require more information, but then you have reduced data requirements based on this hazard classification. So if these are not classified, then you have some reduction in data requirements that we have also covered in the part 1 of the webinar when we are looking more into this data requirements. Of course, you can do the joint registration in Korea. There are exemptions in R&D, which is covered under exemptions from registration. And you also have a product notification, like priority control substances are defined in Korea, similar to your HVACs. So this is also like different term in Korea. And safety data sheets, again, a difference that you need to, of course, comply with this KOSHA requirements for the MSDS. This is termed as MSDS in Korea, and whereas in Europe you call SDS. And this also needs to be submitted to the authority either by you using only representative, which is of course a different requirement, which we will of course cover later in the webinars. And then it is also required to be submitted to the authority. So certification is not essentially there, but submission is there. And then again, dossier review is not mandated by the regulation. Next slide, please. Coming to this existing substance registration, I will also briefly touch upon the certain important deadlines. Next slide, please. So looking at the basics, that the Korea, if you are exporting, or the Korean your customer is importing substances either as such or in the mixtures, then you need to see that whether these are existing, and we are terming this slide for existing substances which has a valid KE number, and then new substances which are having more than selling more than 100 kilos a year would need K-REACH registration. So it's basically of course you have a timelines that you will see next, but these are the 4 tonnage band which are essentially same as European REACH: 1 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 1000, and more than 1000 tons. And you have registration types also similar. However, for the interest of audience, since you are familiar with European REACH, we are trying to explain this term in similar manner, that you have a full substance registration where you need to have a data requirements. Of course, for co-registration, you will see how this is fulfilled. And then you have transported isolated intermediates, which essentially are not looking at the full data set registration, but there are certain conditions that you will omit certain data here to apply to get your registration here, or it is something which is slightly different. And then on-site isolated intermediate, we have essentially exemption in Korea. So you don't need registration for this, but it is, you have to apply for exemption from registration if you are into this. And this is, I think, for Korean entities only. And then your submission is in South Korean language. You will see that we have important information coming up in the next slides, how the systems are. You will see this K-REACH IT system, for example, how it looks like. Next slide, please. And this is the deadline. So we have now more than 1000 tons has already passed. And of course, if you have substances which are of concern like CMR category, where more than 1 ton is also gone. So you have, if you have in this first band of substances, number 1 type and number 2, then you need to apply for direct registration before you enter the Korean market. So 31st of December 2021 has already passed, and you are now having 3 deadlines, which is 100 to 1000 is the focus of this webinar, which is end of this December. And then we have 10 to 100 in 2027, 1 to 10 in 2030. All the registrations will go into the evaluation process, which is now in Korea's terms at hazard review and risk management. And then they will be treating this further regulatory controls based on the information they receive in the dossiers. Then existing substances, as I mentioned, that more than 1000 tons it has you have passed. But if you are looking to register these substances, you need to discuss separately, and we need to see what provisions are available for you to access market, because sometimes it may take more time to register more than 1000 tons. So but then this is the requirement that you need to consider direct registration before you access the market. And for new substances also, you need to register before you access the market. And more than 1000 tons is the registration. Sorry, more than 100 tons is direct registration, and less than 100 tons, it's a simple notification. Next slide, please. And here you see the process that I was trying to explain, that for the existing substances, you have a provision of late P registration, which will give you extended timeline for registration. And so we are talking about this deadline, which is more than 100 tons. And then you have a few more 2 deadlines coming up in 27 and 2030. And once you register, you pre-register, you need to register before these deadlines. And this is also, we will cover this as a co-registration in this webinar. And after registration process, it will undergo the hazard review for the substances to be defined this as a toxic substance which require specific controls if it is used in Korea. So there are additional requirements for importers, and you of course need to provide more information. And then it will undergo the risk assessment, which defines the chemical safety assessment and report that will go part of the registration. You will see in the later part of this webinar, and is required only for more than 10 tons. And then it is up to the authorities with the all kind of consultations to define the substances for further regulatory controls, either authorization, restrictions, prohibition, and some of the substances are already on these list. And if you need some more information, you can contact us. We can provide what are the substances which are prohibited, restricted, and require authorization. And then for PEC, you have to basically directly apply for registration if you want to sell more than 1 ton, because their deadline has already before this 2018 you have to register. So that is something you cannot access market for PEC substances. For new substances, also the similar, you have to apply for direct registrations or simpler notification. So this is also you need to consider while planning for your business in South Korea. Next slide, please. So this is, we will of course cover this in the later part in more in detail. What I wanted to explain is that in Korea, there is a joint submission concept for existing substances. So all the substances which are same will be under this joint submission process where of course there is a opt-out provision possible, but we are only covering joint submission here in this webinar. And this is defined in Article 15 and 16 of Co-Reach Act, which is the main legislation. And all the substances which are pre-registered will be part of this CICO. We will of course see how it functions. But then you have one company which takes the leadership position, try to manage the registration. You will see also how it is done. And we have covered this more in detail in the part 1. But then the co-registration is the focus of this webinar. So once we assume that there is a lead registrant and dossier is available and you have access to all the information you need to apply for co-registration. So this is assuming that we will cover our later part of the slides. But then this is a co-registrant means that you would like to buy data or get access to the data to complete your registration. And this needs to be, of course, submitted to Ministry of Environment before the registration deadline. Next slide, please. And this is on the lead registration, like what they need to do, what are the responsibilities in the CICO. And for existing substances, there is a pre-submission procedure like cooperation within the CICO to initiate this work. And we have covered this in part 1. So I would recommend to please run through this webinar on our YouTube channel. Clarify your substance identity, collect all the information that you have for the data requirements for different tonnage band. And then this is also similar to what you have seen, that this letter of access is not for profit. So you have to share the cost fairly, transparently, and non-discriminatory manner, which allows co-registrants to access market without any biased approach. And then also continual the post maintenance is done in the similar manner. So this is similar to what we have seen in European REACH, is that letter of access is something who's taking over this responsibility must adhere to this requirement. And then managing and submitting the joint registration on to the member of Ministry of Environment under Co-Reach IT system. And this is also that has to be done before the deadline, which allows co-registrants enough time to submit their registration, which is, let's say, 100 to 1000 is by December. So we have covered all the timelines also in this part 1, when they should start working, when they should start submitting the dossier, lead dossier. And then once it is submitted, they have responsibility to manage that registration in the joint registration. It's a continuous requirement, of course. And then keeping all the record and communication with authorities is also part of this maintenance. Next slide. Looking at this co-registration process, once you have a lead registrant, then of course co-registration can play their part and they can proceed with the registration. And this cooperation of CICO is will be covered more in detail, active and passive, for example, and we will of course help you understand where you stand, and you can decide And if you need more consultation, you of course can contact us. Substance identity is still important because you in the pre-registration phase, you don't provide much information. So you have noticed that you are in different CEF and you are registering in different identity. So to avoid that, it's important that the co-registrations do it very carefully to save time and see that the identity is similar to what lead has provided, and regardless of what you have submitted in past, but to be careful in the substance identity check. And then share the data if the joint submission already exists, and there is a provision that you can use your own data if you have from the other jurisdictions like you reach. But then this is a separate procedure which you can discuss with us if you own this data and you would like to use this data for also for the joint submission purpose. Then the sharing of the cost is like purchase of letter of access. You have to pay to the lead registrant or the nominated entity for the lead registrant to handle these procedures. And then you need to compile and submit the co-registration. So which is, of course, we will cover more in detail how it is, what kind of data requirements you are looking at for co-registration before you submit this to the Ministry of Environment. And this is also similar done in K-Reach IT system in Korean language. And once you receive the registration, you need to also keep it up to date and also keeping other records for audit trail purposes with the authorities and other communication with third parties. So with this, I think you will go to the next slide, please. Here are some of the fees, which is one of the component you will see in the later part of the slides on the cost of registration. So for registration, you have a fee to be paid to the authorities, and you can see the registration fee in this link, which is in Korean language. But there are certain discounts for the medium-sized companies and small companies. But if you see the fees, these are already nominal cost for registration, both as joint and individual. We are covering joint submissions in this webinar. And then you also have to consider update fees if you register in lower tonnage band and you want to update your registration. So and then there are other updates which are applicable for all tonnage bands. So there are certain fees which is basically depending upon the submission, but we are most for registration we are covering on this slide. But if you want more fees, then yeah, I would encourage you to go through this web link on this slide. Next slide, please. So we will focus, as I mentioned in this webinar, the existing substance co-registration as part of joint submission. Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you, Gagan, very much for this thorough run through of the basics. And I will continue from here. So looking at the co-registration process from data access to submission. So here we have some sub high headlines. So we'll look at first at the pre-registration, from pre-registration to co-registration, give you essentially an overview. Then we'll dive more in depth into the CICO and the joint registration effort. We'll look at data and cost sharing, and more specifically the letter of access process, and then finally look at how to compile the dossier and prepare it for submission. Look at some timelines and some costs, and then we'll go to the next section. So a lot to cover here, and as mentioned earlier, we will go over time as per usual. But anyway, let's first start with providing just an overview of the different players. I just call them players as part of this joint registration effort. So of course we have the joint submission, but as part of the joint submission and entities and these sort of functions that come into play are these a lot of different actors, if you will, that we will all go through. But just wanted to show here in this slide the different actors, because all of these we're going to go through in more detail in the next slides, and you will see these mentioned several times. So this is just to give you an overview. I will not even read through them because we'll cover them in just a second. So looking at an overview of this process from pre-registration to lead registration, from pre-registration to co-registration, I should say, hazards of reusing some slide templates. So once a company pre-registers, so late submits, for example, late pre-registration or already has pre-registered a substance for K-REACH purposes, then they still have to separately join this CICO, so this Chemical Substance Information Communicative Organization, or sometimes called KCIF, but essentially equals a CIF under EU REACH, as Gagan already discussed. So the CICO will be populated by other members aiming to register the same substance. So at this point, you would also check the sameness criteria for this CICO, so that just to make sure that you have the same substance. And this can be checked by using this substance identity profile, or sometimes it can be also called something else. Then as a next step, the company should decide on the role in this CICO. Well, they will not become the lead registrant because that was the previous webinar, despite the headline it says here. But you as a co-registrant, you should then decide whether you want to be an active participant in the work, if available, or passive or dormant. We'll talk about this in just a second. And where a lead registrant has not yet been selected, then you should select one and you can vote for that. We talked about that in the previous webinar. We'll touch upon it briefly also here. And then the active CICO members become a part of a so-called registration consortium. This is a bit different than what we thought about consortia for EU REACH, because this is only specific to this substance and a subset of the CICO. We'll talk about that just in a second. And only active members and the lead registrants are becoming members of this registration consortium. Passive dormant CICO members are not members of the consortium. They are still members, of course, of the CICO. Then the lead registrant, of course, prepares their dossier, submits it to the MOE. This NIR checks, the National Institute of Environment checks the compliance of this, and once it's okayed, it's been approved, then the active members, as part of this registration consortium, can submit their dossiers, their co-registration dossiers to the ministry, and in parallel, the letter of access issuance starts for these passive dormant CICO members, or in case may be registrants that come in later and are not part of the this joint submission or this joint, or preparing for the joint registration effort, so to speak. They might have already submitted the dossier and thus just come in late into the game, and we call them here later registrants. Once these have all the paperwork, so to speak, in place, meaning purchase the letter of access, they can prepare the co-registration dossier and submit it, of course, to the ministry and then be done with it. So we'll essentially go through this process in more detail during this the next slides. So many and much of the information I'm going to show you in these slides is not that relevant if the joint submission has already or the joint registration has been submitted, meaning a joint submission already exists. So meaning maybe it was registered for the 2021 registration deadline. It means that all the effort per se has been done, and at this point in time there's no other options but to join essentially as a passive member or as a later registrant, more accurately. So just keep that in mind. So if you look at the CICO and the joint registration effort, this is a slide we looked at last time, but this has been augmented a bit. So we have, of course, the company that submitted a pre-registration and entered separately into the CICO. It's done in the IT system by clicking essentially a tab or a box. So it's a click box exercise to go from a pre-registration status to become a CICO member. In this CICO, you have a lead registrant. Either you elect it or you can have a so-called CICO coordinator coordinate the effort of becoming the lead. In many cases, they are the same. So a lead registrant used to be a coordinator. I'll come back to this in just a while, but just to show, maybe give a bit of background, how the lead becomes the lead. But I said I'll come back to that. Then the lead has and appoints a representative consulting company, or the CICO selects a representative consulting company to take care of the practical work for preparing the joint registration effort. So this encompasses many tasks, and we'll talk about that in a few slides. Then you have the registration consortium. Of course, the lead registrant is a member thereof. This registration consortium is populated by the lead and the active CICO members, and you could consider it, for lack of a better word, as a steering entity for the CICO for the purpose of preparing for this joint registration effort. So it's a subset of CICO members that are very interested in working on this joint registration effort together with the lead, and then coordinated with this representative consulting company. So I will call it RCC in some of the slides here. So this representative consulting company, as I said, it can be a professional care service provider, it can be REACHLaw, Korea, and so forth, but we could not be the lead registrant at the same time as being a representative consulting company. I'll come back to that in just a second. The active members, as well as the lead registrant as part of this registration consortium, are the ones that are bearing the initial costs for getting things up and running for the purpose of preparing this joint submission. Then we have other members of the CICO. We have the passive members. These are members that are not don't want to become a members of the registration consortium because they are, as the name suggests, more passive in nature, but they still are part of the data collection effort. So they will still have to engage to a limited degree in the joint registration effort. But these are the companies who then need to buy a letter of access. And the same goes for these dormant CICO members. So these are members that essentially do not take part in any of the work because they're not interested, for example, and they do not bear any of the initial cost. Neither did the passive members, but they can, of course, provide the law later on. I mean, purchase the letter of access later on to become members of the joint submission. Then we also have these later registrants. Say, for example, the substance was registered already earlier than most newcomers. That, for example, you would now start placing a substance on the South Korean market. You would submit the late pre-registration, and then you would enter the CICO, and you would be essentially a later registrant, and you would only be able to buy a letter of access. You would not be part of joint registration effort. You would be part of the joint submission, but not as part of the initial effort to prepare the lead dossier and submit it to the ministry, and thus submit jointly information. But you will be a member of the joint submission, but not the initial effort of preparing all the dossiers and stuff like that. And then, of course, we have NEAR, the National Institute of Environment in Korea, who is then reviewing and assessing these registration dossiers, and finally then issuing the registration number, which is the stamp of approval, so to speak, and something that every registrant is seeking, because then it's, once you get the registration number, then you are effectively registered for that substance. So a lot of different players, and in the EU, for EU REACH, we did have these active, passive, dormant type of a approach also to some level, but here it really is maybe even more prevalent, and especially what makes it unique is really this representative consulting company. We'll talk about that in just a few slides. So we'll call this this setup that we just looked at a typical CICO setup in this presentation. So when I'm talking about a typical CICO setup, that is the one we just looked at. So having a lead registrant and this representative consulting company, active CICO members, passive, dormant where applicable, and later registrants where applicable. So the registration consulting company is really a unique way of working in South Korea, because it's essentially, in most cases, it's independent third-party service provider, such for example as REACHLaw. It's not a concept that's defined in the legal text or in the guidance per se, but it's a best practice approach in South Korea for K-REACH registration, joint registration effort, that is. So as mentioned in the previous slide, typically the lead registrant initiates the contact with this consulting company, representative consulting company, for the purpose of then getting organized and starting taking over the practical work. So the lead registrant actually doesn't do that much except initiate the contact with this RCC, and then of course submit the dossier and being an active CICO member in a sense. But other than that, in typical cases, this representative consulting company is taking care of the rest. And what makes it even more peculiar is that who can and who cannot appoint an RCC, who cannot be an RCC in this CICO. So the lead registrant cannot, it's not specifically forbidden, but it should not become this RCC. And if the lead becomes, then likely the ministry will come back to you and ask for you to change the lead registrant in this CICO, so that the lead registrant is not the same company as this RCC. But a co-registrant can become an RCC. So apparently there is no conflict of interest there, which is quite interesting. Or then it can also be, most typically, is that it is a third-party service provider for K-REACH services, such as, for example, REACHLaw Korea. That is the RCC in a CICO. So I will not go into details. There are a lot of text on our slides today, but essentially this RCC company typically essentially takes care of all the practical work related to setting up the registration consortium, managing the letter of access process, taking care of the communication between all the different members as part of these different cohorts. So the registration consortium members, the CICO members, depending on their role, communication with authorities, collecting data, preparing data gap analysis, preparing the lead dossier, CSRs, taking care of cost sharing, itemizing costs, and so forth. And of course, managing the letter of access sales and all general type of communication reporting with all the stakeholders, checking regulatory developments, because this RCC is typically there for a longer time, because we could have, for example, registrations done in 21, but there will still be co-registrants coming in later on, for example, for the last registration deadline. So this then there needs to be a function. This representative consulting company needs to be there to be able to, for example, issue letter of accesses for these later registrants, and of course take care of dossier updates and record keeping and so forth. As for lead registrants, well, it's quite clear that each CICO must have a lead registrant, and any member can nominate themselves to become a lead registrant. This applies, of course, to situations where the lead registration work hasn't essentially started. If it's this is the case for 2024, then now is the time to really get active on this part, as discussed in the previous webinar. But if there are two or more lead registrant candidates, then there needs to be an election, which is typically initiated by this CICO coordinator. So this is like a function to just get organized to get the lead registrant elected or selected. So typically, in many cases, the CICO coordinator is the one who has the highest vested interest. in many cases, the CICO coordinator also appoints themselves or nominates themselves as a lead registrant. But at the end of the day, the lead registrant has to be appointed by the CICO members by a majority vote. And once that vote has happened and it's taken care of electronically in this Co-Reach IT system, then the CICO coordinator role essentially disappears, and then you have a lead registrant who then takes the next step of appointing this representative consulting company to take care of the practical work, and then you still have the active members, CICO members, and so forth, starting this registration consortium work. So this is a bit of repetition from last webinar, but now with maybe a bit more focus from a co-registrant perspective also. So obviously, when someone is elected, you selected someone as a lead registrant, then of course they should also notify all the CICO members that this has happened if it is unclear for someone. So as mentioned, due to this representative consulting company approach, that's like a best practice in South Korea for Co-Reach registration work to prepare the joint registration effort, the joint submission, that is, the lead registrant role is diminished in the sense that you essentially just there to kick off things and submit dossiers, and of course be an active participant in the registration consortium. But other than that, it's much less prominent than a lead, for example, for EU Reach, which typically also prepares the dossiers themselves and also submits and manages everything. Also applicable in Turkey and so on. So this is a bit of a peculiarity for Co-Reach, this representative consulting company approach. Okay, next let's look at data and cost sharing, and more specifically the letter of access part. And thank you for those attendees who are still with us. We will not be ready in 3 minutes, as you could imagine, I think. Anyway, let's look at the data sharing as a member of the CICO. So this could be you as a co-registrant, potential co-registrant. So obviously, when you are registering a substance, you need to submit. So you need to take part in this core registration data that is essentially the physical, chemical, toxicological, ecotoxicological data that is defined in the Co-Reach regulation and related regulations. And this data is, of course, something that the higher the tonnage, the more data you need to submit and so forth. And this is done by the lead. But as a member of the joint submission, so as a co-registrant, you are also responsible for providing any such data that is needed for the joint registration effort that you can share, have legitimate access to, that could benefit everyone in the CICO. And of course, you will be compensated for this information. So this may be the case if you have EU Reach registered and you have this data available from EU Reach that can be used for Co-Reach purposes, and you have legitimate access to it, and you have the rights to share it with outside of EU Reach, for example, then this is something that you should share. So typically information is collected from these CICO members first, but if as part of data gap analysis you see that we're still missing something, then, which is usually the case, then you go to third parties and collect this information outside of the CICO. So this RCC should have a process for collecting this information from all the members of the CICO. I will talk about this a bit more in the next slide. If this is not happening, then of course you as a CICO member should ask, why is this not happening? And this only applies now for situations where the joint submission is not available yet, meaning the lead dossier hasn't been submitted. So early in this lead registration process, this representative consulting company should then communicate by email, typically, to all the CICO members, explain what data should be shared based on data requirements for that tonnage band of that substance, what data will be needed for this specific lead registration. So based on the data gap analysis, for example, the preliminary data gap analysis, ask then the CICO members to identify do they have any of these relevant endpoints that are needed for this specific joint submission, so studies, and whether they have legitimate access to it, then they can use it for this registration purpose. They will ask also to then share this information and also any associated cost-related information, because you will get compensated for this, for sharing the data. No one has to share anything for free unless it's 15 years or older data. We'll come back to that in the next slide. So to join a joint submission, each co-registrant must obtain legitimate access to the data. These IPR issues must be considered when you are compiling the lead dossier, and this access to the data, access to the joint submission should also be and must be provided if the CICO members have compensated for the data and the work that has been conducted. So essentially bought a letter of access, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And all of this has to happen under, in Korea it's called fair, clear, and independent conditions. So essentially it means the same as fair, under fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory conditions. So a bit different verbal acrobatics here, but still the meaning, the spirit is the same. You cannot discriminate anyone. You have to be transparent and clear in providing information and breakdown of costs. You have to be fair. Again, you can't just say, yes, you can join, you cannot, and so forth. And the independent meaning that you're independently verifying all the information, itemizing cost and so forth. You're not in cahoots with anyone for any obscure purposes, undermined purposes, and so forth. So again, fair, transparent, non-discriminatory, I think describes it a bit better. At least from us who've been hammered with these words for EU REACH and K-REACH and the KKDIK and UK REACH, for example. And in K-REACH, data that is 15 years or older can be used for free, and no one can charge for that data. They can still charge for the work needed to compile a lead dossier or a joint submission and so forth, but they cannot charge for the data. So this is quite interesting. It's not applicable yet because it's not been 15 years since the first registrations happened in Korea. So this is not something that is relevant yet. It is applicable, but it's not relevant yet. But good to know. In the EU, we have 12 years. In Korea, it's 15. So how do you get legitimate access to data? Because you have essentially two types of members. You have the registration consortium members, and then you have everyone else who was, for example, active, passive, or dormant CICO member or later registrant. So how do they get access? So the registration consortium members get access to the data via the registration consortium agreement, where they define how much they have to pay for the data, but what they also have to do as active members of the joint registration effort. And once they've done and fulfilled those requirements as members of the registration consortium, then they also get access to the data as co-registrants, and they can submit their own registrations once the lead dossier has been approved. But for everyone else, and this will be more the focus in this rest of the presentation, is that for everyone else, meaning who are not members of the registration consortium, who are, for example, later registrants, they buy a letter of access as issued by the registration consortium and pay this letter of access fee and sign the related agreements, and thus get access to the data and have rights to refer to the data that was submitted as part of this joint registration. And of course, everything costs. So the letter of access fee is will be the highest, typically the highest cost per registration, even for co-registrants. So in this, as mentioned in this presentation, we'll focus more on how these non-registration consortium members, so the passive, dormant, later registrants, get access to the data, because this will be the prevailing case in most cases. So looking at the law process, so what you do is typically you have two ways. So for example, if the lead registration work is coming to an end, then when all costs are available, then the lead registrant usually communicates that this letter of access is available to all the CICO members, or more specifically, this representative consulting company, as discussed before. Sometimes the lead can send the communication, but in most cases, it's actually this RCC who will do it, saying that the letter of access is available, or if this lead registration effort or the registration has already been submitted, for example, in 2021 by the deadline, then of course the joint submission work has been done. Then it's just a matter of when joining the CICO, ask from this representative consulting company for letter of access details. And if you're doing this for the deadline of this year, then of course start doing this as soon as possible. Then the CICO member who is received this letter of access information should of course review, sign, and the law agreement and pay the fee. And then you will the fee depends on the type of registration, tonnage band, of course. And then if you have own data, you will not have to pay for that, because you already have legitimate access to that. You should do this as soon as possible, of course. Also, time flies. Then this representative consulting company or the lead, depends on who has access then to this K-Reach IT system, grants access to this co-registrant CICO member who purchased the letter of access, so that this CICO member can actually then go ahead and submit the co-registration as part of this joint submission. And what is peculiar is that actually you first have to pay the Ministry of Environment registration fee that Gagan talked about, include a payment reference that you will get, everything happens online, and include this payment reference in the dossier that you will submit to the MOE. So I think this is a very good way of doing it, because then you don't have to wait for any invoices or payment delays and stuff like that. You have it's clear in advance that you have paid, and once you submit, then it's just to wait for the NIR to come back and check that your dossier complies and provide the registration number. As mentioned, typically the most expensive part is the letter of access, so the data you are have the right to refer to in the joint submission when you buy this letter of access as a co-registrant member. So the law, what is included in the scope of the letter of access, and good to know, is of course the basic information of essentially the boundary composition. So what is the supported purity ranges of the substances included in this particular substance as impurities, and the main constituents and so forth, identified uses, classification, labeling information, GHS information, that is Korean. These are the same for all the registrants. The use information may be, of course, a subset in your case, but they should be covered in the lead dossier in the joint submission, by the joint submission. Then there's an optional coverage for including the chemical safety report. Either it can be omitted completely, or then the lead registrant may provide a template for co-registrants to populate and submit individually. Guidance of safe use is the same, it's optional, albeit in most cases the lead registrants actually submit this jointly on behalf of the co-registrants, but it's not mandatory. So as mentioned, you only have to pay for data that you need for your registration. So you do not have to pay for data that you own, have legitimate access to, and you could use it for your registration purposes. But this has to be, if this is the case and you come into a CICO that has submitted already the dossier, then you need to customize, or the RCC needs to customize the letter of access to suit your situation, meaning tick off the costs for this particular endpoint that you already have legitimate access to. So that is something that you have to have a discussion with the RCC. But in any case, it has to be fair, clear, and independent, meaning fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory. Or the whole data sharing and cost sharing, of course. So if you look at what information is communicated, then as part of this law process. So what is the data package? So first, the data package, of course, that is shared with the CICO members, potential co-registrants, include the letter of access price. Or it can also include the cost breakdown. If it's not, you can always ask for it. It typically includes an agreement, including cost sharing principles, and a separate acceptance letter. There are different mechanisms for this, but in this example, we have this acceptance letter approach. Once the acceptance letter is then signed, or similar approach, then this representative consulting company will send an invoice to this potential co-registrant, and once the invoice has been paid, then the RCC will provide access to the joint submission and optionally share, as mentioned or as discussed, this CSR template where applicable, GSU, so guidance of safe use information, and other supporting information for co-registrants to prepare their dossier. Maybe they have a mock-up dossier, like a template that explains what the information you need to put in where in the K-REACH IT system and stuff like that. In e-REACH, it meant in some cases sharing an iEuclid dossier template with pre-populated iEuclid dossier template. But in Korea, everything is online, so you can't share anything that you can upload per se into the K-REACH IT system. So that would be a separate document explaining what fields to populate with what information, perhaps. But earlier in the process, as discussed, you should already have checked the substance identity profile, also the classification and labeling information according to the Korea GHS, as well as what uses are covered. So identified uses are covered. And good to know that the lead registrant, or in this case the RCC, have the obligation to provide these potential registrants with the cost breakdown if they don't provide it as part of the letter of access. So you can always ask them to document and provide the cost sharing model if it's not clear in the letter of access. In most cases it would be, and if possible, they should also allocate the cost at the endpoint level, itemize all costs, also data and administrative costs. In some cases, if the 15-year rule applies, which it won't for several years, but let's say it would, then maybe some data would not cost anything anymore, but there would be administrative costs that you still need to pay. So there will likely not be a situation where the letter of access is free. Only data could be free, but all the admin work for the RCC to manage the CICO and so forth and registration consortium, that still costs. And provide justifications for the cost and reimbursement schemes and so forth. So this should all be provided by the lead, or in this case, the representative consulting company. So good to know. So now let's look at the registration dossier preparation and submission. And thank you for those who still are with us. We're going over time as expected. As per usual, if you look at the co-registration dossier and how to compile it, so what does the co-registration dossier contain? So these put on my pointer. So information on the manufacturer importer, this is where you would provide basic information on the identity of the company, are you importer, OR, and so forth, provide information on the substance, tonnage, band, and these sort of administrative type of information. Section 2 is something that you then define the substance, you name, molecular formula, and structural information, etc., but you do not include the analytical information. In some cases, the NIR may ask you to provide it in hindsight, but you do not include it by default in the dossier. This applies also to the lead dossier, but we'll focus on co-registration here. Use of the substance, so what are your specific identified uses, and maybe you have uses advised against, so not supported uses. These should also be included here. Then in some cases, as said, it may be that you provide guidance of safe use yourself if the lead doesn't do it on your behalf, on behalf of the whole joint submission, but this should be agreed in the CICO. The same goes for the CSR. So sometimes the lead submits the CSRs, but in many cases they will provide a template for you to populate and submit it to yourself, and you would include it under this risks and chemical safety report section in the dossier. Also, if you submit information on intermediates or registering intermediates, you would have information on control conditions here to be included. But once all of this is populated, then you compile the dossier and create it, submit it to the ministry. And of course, before that, you as we discussed, you need to pay the registration fee. Thankfully, it's not a large sum. So once you submit it, it goes for approval to the NIR. So in some cases, it's quite typical that although the CSR or the CSR template is provided, it's quite typical that the exposure scenarios are not. And this is quite interesting, and this deviates from EU REACH and Turkey KKD-IK, for example. So if this is the case, that exposure scenarios are not included, then you as a co-registrant have to develop these exposure scenarios if it applies to you for these identified uses that are relevant for you. So this can be done in the KSR tool. We talked about this a bit more in the previous webinar, so I invite you to have a look at that with information from the hazard assessment part of the CSR, which should be then shared, or you should have this information available, and then of course your specific identified uses. We will not delve into the depth how to do this, but it can be quite tricky, or let's say it is quite tricky. So in most cases, companies resort to using professional K-REACH consultants who have this capability, have used the KSR tool in the past and so forth. So such as REACHLaw Korea again, to compile these exposure scenarios that need to be included. And just I'd like to highlight that albeit we're not focusing on pre-registrations here, you can look at our December 12 webinar, but you should also be aware that as part of this pre-registration, you should already have included information on these identified uses at that part. You would not provide exposure scenario information, but the identified uses that you use to prepare the exposure scenarios should be already in the pre-registration, which is also different from EU REACH back in the day, for example, or Turkey KKD for that matter. However, if the CSR is not provided at all by the lead, not even a template to populate, then of course this is where you would have to then prepare your own CSR. But if a CSR template is provided, then you need to adapt that one to your specific information on the uses, on the substance information, tonnage bands, other company specific information, much in the same way as we did for and are doing, for example, for EU REACH at the moment. So this is the typical case. So the lead provides this type of, or this RCC provides this CSR template for co-registrants to populate. The population per se of this template is not that big of a deal because it's already information that you should have available. The bigger deal is, as said, if it's not available at all, this template, then you have to go and do the CSR from scratch. And for that, I recommend looking at this part 1 webinar we had a couple of weeks ago. But once you have the final CSR, then you will need to include it in the dossier for submission to the ministry. So we'll skip this one as I already discussed this, and just to highlight that it is available on YouTube, so you can look at some screenshots on how the KSR looks like for CSR preparation. But if you look at the actual dossier preparation work, preparing this co-registration dossier in the K-REACH IT system, of course, everything is in Korean language as Gagan already discussed, but you need to have access to this system, and it requires that you are based in essentially in Korea, South Korea, to be able to access this system. So you have to have credentials to have an account in the system. But other than that, when you start the work, here is where you access CICO, but here is where you access the substance registration dialog, which we'll look at next. So my South Korean is not good, so I will not even attempt to read all that's here on the slide, but you can see that here on the left-hand side, you can see what sections need to be populated. Depending on the registration dossier, if it's a lead, you need to fill in all. If it's a co-registration, there are less options available. But here in the first section, provide business, company information, registrant information, contact details. You can also claim whether you're an SME or not. Here in the next section or next part, you provide information on the substance. And in the third part here, you provide, for example, information on the tonnage band, type of registration, data protection, and so forth. Then in the next view, you provide information on uses and uses recommended against, for example, uses to avoid, as called here in the slides. More information on the uses. In the second part, classification information. In the third part, labeling information. And you can add several classifications and several labels also to this registration. So this is, again, a bit different from EU REACH, for example, or Turkey KKDIK, where the classification information, unless you did an opt-out, was submitted by the lead. In Korea, each co-registrant also populates these classification and labeling information according to Korean GHS. Then you also have you need to attach files, chemical safety reports, for example, guidance of safe use, exposure scenarios, OR agreements, safety data sheets. This is interesting that you also need to submit safety data sheets as part of the this registration dossier. SME certificates where applicable, and so forth. Third-party information where applicable is also provided here, other documentation, and finally also information on the payment. So as mentioned earlier, you first pay the fee, get a receipt, a reference number, and this information has to be populated in a dossier before you submit it. Only once all this information is here can you submit it to the for evaluation by the NIR. So they will do a completeness check. NIR does this completeness check. So the National Institute of Environment in Korea, they do a completeness compliance check, and once this has been passed, then you will issue a registration number and you're done with your registration. Besides this, you will of course have the obligation as any registrant, whether it's a lead registrant or a co-registrant, to keep this dossier up to date. And sometimes when new information becomes available from the lead registrant, maybe the NIR says that you need to update, or the lead registrant needs to update something. The consortium may require something to be updated spontaneously due to new information becoming available, or just due to quality update reasons. Legislative requirements, technical requirements, and so forth may then trigger these update requirements. So it's as I believe I did mention last time, it's really more of a journey than a destination, preparing the registration dossier. So it's ongoing for as long as you're placing and having these chemicals on the Korean market. Okay, so coming close to the end here. So looking at the timelines, again, in this timeline, we will assume that the co-registration, the lead registration process has been concluded, meaning the joint submission exists. Lead dossier has been submitted, and there's no need, and it's not even possible to accept any new active CICO members, because if all the work is done, there's no point in being an active CICO member. This is the likely scenario for most cases. So what this means is that if we are here today, in the mid actually, we have the deadline at far right. Then we have pre-registered, we have checked that we have the same substance, we have become a member. of the CICO, you are a passive member or maybe a dormant, in this case a passive, because there's really no other choices. Determine then who is the lead registrant. There's a possibility to check this in this notice board in K-Reach IT system, where you can see in the CICO information, or you can also get this information from NEAR if it's not on this notice board of the CICO in the K-Reach IT system. I think this was one question we had. You contact the lead registrant, or if you know the lead, or then this better yet, this representative consulting company for lead letter of access details. But in parallel, you can already start collecting the data you need for co-registration purposes. You check, review, pay, and go through the hoops of obtaining the letter of access. At this point, you would also have received access to the joint submission by the lead or this representative consulting company. Then you start preparing your co-registration dossier. Maybe you need to prepare these exposure scenarios, CSR, at least the CSR template to be modified with your information is the most likely situation. You submit it to the MOE, and NEAR does the compliance check. Initial review is 30 days, typically, if, not typically, but if additional reviews are needed, they can add more than 60 days to the check. So in a worst situation, you could end up having almost 90 days review period for the co-registration dossier, and this also applies to the lead dossier by NEAR. So it's good to at least submit at least 3 months before the deadline of December 31st, 2024, this year that is, your dossier for this deadline for 100 to 1,000 ton substances. So once its review has been completed, everything is okay, you will get the registration number and your co-registration is complete. And at this point in time, you can, of course, be happy that you have completed the registration of your substance, and you can at least relax for a while. And in this case, we've assumed that the whole process takes about 8 months from start to finish. It can be, of course, quicker here, but it's good to at least keep in mind to have at least 3 months window for NEAR to review your dossier, just to be on the safe side. It may be at the end of the day, they may say that, okay, if you submitted, then it's okay. But at the moment, this is the situation. So in 2021, they had some sort of, let's say, special provisions that allowed companies to submit late, and they would still be considered as registered after the deadline, even though the review was not completed. But we'll aim for submitting for at least 3 months before the deadline. That is our recommendation. And the costs, really quickly, these are not absolute figures. These are quantitative figures, if you will, just showing the portions of work versus letter of access versus the authority fees. Of course, the authority fees are very small, so they will play a very small part. Your work will cost something, but data, meaning letter of access costs, and including not just the data, but all the work done for preparing the joint registration, will be included here. So it will play the highest part in the total cost for co-registration or registering a substance. Okay, so quick co-registration action plan before we go to the conclusions and Q&A. And again, apologies for going over time. Thought this would have been quicker than the lead part, but anyway, here we are. So a quick registration action plan. I think you know these already by now, but maybe just to boil it down, recommend to start ASAP. Determine what resources you have. Of course, if you have an only representative taking care of this, then you already have the resources. But let's say you are a subsidiary or you have a company in South Korea importing, then you need to check. Do you need external resources to help with this or not? Verify that you have the same substance, very important. Vote for your lead registrant candidate if that is applicable to your case. Follow these discussions in the CICO. Very important that you know what's going on, especially if the lead registration work is still ongoing. The lead has not submitted yet. Engage with this representative consulting company and follow the progress of this joint registration work and share information where needed, where asked, and be proactive, even though you might not be an active CICO member per se. Purchase the letter of access sooner than later and make sure that your users, relevant users are covered in this lead dossier. If not, then you would have to prepare your own CSR and exposure scenarios covering those users, of course. That's a separate topic. We'll not discuss it here in more detail. And prepare your co-registration dossier submitted in good time. I said at least 3 months to be on the safe side before the deadline is good to do. So submit it at least 3 months before the end of the year deadline to give near ample time to check your dossier. Document everything, your communication with the lead registrants, with this representative consulting company and so forth, so that you have an audit trail what's happened if something goes wrong. And of course, you need to keep things up to date. As always, it's not a destination, it's a journey. Okay, conclusions. I will just omit these because this is a bit of a rehash. Just wanted to say that if you need help with any of this, need an only representative in Korea for K-REACH purposes or K-OSHA purposes, then of course REACHLaw is very happy to step in and help you with that. So we have time for doing even a lead registration for the end of the year deadline, and certainly have time for doing co-registrations. So please feel free to contact us at any time. We're happy to support you with your compliance efforts. So you can always ask for example, a K-REACH only representative quotation, including, for example, co-registration services and K-OSHA MSDS services, and feel free to contact, for example, at sales@reachlaw.fi or then Gagan or myself directly. So now let's go to the Q&A. I see that we've received some questions in the chat, and also we have a few questions that was pre-submitted before or as part of the registration to this webinar. So I'll just have these pop up here, and we can take first the pre-submitted questions. So we took 5 of those questions here. Some were similar, so essentially or they were answered more specifically in the presentation, so they are not included here, but some are, 5 are. So first question, what are the obligations of a contract manufacturer? So this means a toll manufacturer, sometimes using that wording, located outside of Korea and manufacturing for sale inside South Korea. So I take it that this means that you are a toll manufacturer, you're using a toll manufacturer for manufacture substances that you then place on the South Korean market. So in this case, it is the toll manufacturer, so your contract manufacturers who, for example, need to appoint an only representative or can appoint an only representative. If you have your customers as importers in South Korea taking care of K-REACH compliance, then you don't have to do anything. But of course, it's not good customer service if you have your customers bearing all the costs, at least directly with compliance. Of course, you will bake the compliance costs into your products where possible if you take care of compliance, for example, through an only representative. But in this case, as said, if you have a toll manufacturer, the toll manufacturer has to do the appointment of the only representative, but of course you can have a separate agreement with the toll manufacturer that the only representative that they have appointed for this particular substance that is yours, that they can only sell it as part of your substance contract to South Korea. meaning that they would not be able to sell it as a competitor to yourselves. But that is typically contracts that are done outside of the standard only representative service agreements. But here, important to know that it is the toll manufacturers has to appoint the Korean only representative. And Gagan, please feel free to chime in at your if I forget to say something.
Yes.
And the second question, has REACHLaw a direct representation in Korea? So we have our own subsidiary, so it is as direct as I guess you can have it. So we have our own dedicated people there and resources, as we saw in the presentation earlier. So REACHLaw Korea Limited in Seoul in the Gangnam district. Feel free to, if you are in South Korea, drop by. It is a very spectacular location, by the way. Gagan, I'll hand the next question to you. So what about exemptions? Do they have to be proven? How? Need to be approved by authorities? We covered this in previous webinars, but maybe you want to just hash it through quickly.
Yes, thank you for reading this. So this exemption, of course, I touched very briefly in this webinar that exemptions in K-REACH are two types. One is the self-declaration and the other one is that you need to apply for the exemption. And I believe this question belongs to that second level of exemption. So yes, you need to prove, and there is a set form I think 6, which defines your exemption application needs to be filled in Korean language, but there is a standard format that needs to be filled, and of course the data requirements varies for the particular application you are applying. So depending upon whether it's research and development or there are other set of exemptions that we have covered in part 1 of the webinar. So based on that, data requirements needs to be fulfilled, and then of course once you submit, authorities gives the decision that your application is accepted for the exemption from the registration, and this means that you can now use this communication to do business with Korea or communicate with your importers. So this needs to be approved by the authorities.
Very good. Thank you, Gagan. Question 4, where can we find out who is the lead registrant for a dossier? So as mentioned in the presentation, you can check the CICO notice board. So you, of course, you have to have pre-registered and joined CICO to be able to see this, or then you could check with NEAR, the National Institute of Environment. They have these places where you can also find this information. And the final question here go ahead, Gagan, please.
Yeah, and it's not public. So if the question is coming from the thought that is it public? So no, it's not public.
Yeah, good point to add. Thank you, Gagan. Last question, I'll probably hand this over to you, Gagan. If the supplier is informed that the PEX substance is present in a chemical used in our product, what should I do? I suppose you are formulating a substance, for example, outside of Korea, South Korea, and now one of those substances is a PEG substance. The deadline for PEG substance registration is over. Do I need to do a late pre-registration and then get supplier OR coverage? Gagan, do you want to take this, or I can complement if needed?
Yeah. So I'll basically this I think thank you, Frederik, for giving this that this is a formulation that a formulator is trying to sell this formulator to Korea, which has this PEC substance inside that, and probably they are not manufacturing this substance. That's why the end question says supplier coverage. But then since it's a PEC substance, as we covered, this is you need to apply for, or your supplier needs to apply for direct registration. But since you are into formulation, you would like to control this formulation and compliances for importers. I would suggest that you apply for direct registration because deadline is over. So there is no late registration for PEC substance. So both it needs to be registered before you can use it in your formulation in the applicable tonnage band. So Frederik, if you would like to add.
Yeah, no, I'm happy with that, and I recommend, as said, to have maybe a look at the this December 12 webinar where we looked maybe discussed PECs a bit more.
Yes.
So, and I think actually we will also have yet another K-Reach webinar at some point where we will talk about these, let's say, these borderline cases or outlier cases where we have for polymers and intermediates and exemptions, new substance registrations, opt-outs, and so forth. So I think we could also include PECs in this specifically. So stay tuned for that. We haven't sent out any information on this, but I think we will do quite soon. So stay tuned for that. And then we have a few questions in the chat. I'll take this really quickly. Very good questions. One was, does the OR approval mean that there is just approved ORs to be appointed? I think what you may be after here is there some sort of a list of companies who are per se approved only representatives in South Korea? So no, essentially anyone who has the competence can be an OR. They of course have to be South Korean companies with the necessary skills, but there's no like a positive list of these. Only these companies are accepted as OR, if I understood the question correctly. Then we had questions on 15-year-old data. So 15-year-old data is the same as 12-year rule in the EU, KKDIK, and UK, or is 50 years from the first submission. So this is from the registration for the first time. So essentially, when the registration was submitted or approved, do not know exactly the details because this is not very relevant at the moment. We can try to dig it out from the guidelines, but I suspect it's essentially when the substance then was registered. So no, it's not the age of the study itself, but related to the time of registration. So essentially very similar to EU, if not the same. EU and KKDIK and so forth. The same question actually, can you confirm 12-year applies in EU, UK, Turkey? Well, that's outside the scope of this, but yes, they have the 12-year rule. In Korea, it's 15. What about Taiwan? I'm not aware about Taiwan. This is, again, go a bit outside the scope of this presentation. But certainly we can find out if need be, regarding Taiwan, that is. And the last question, what needs to be in the dossier with regards to uses? Is that the 55 defined uses? Do these need to be confirmed by the importers one by one? So indeed, these are the standard 55 defined identified uses. So you need to pick from this pick list, and yes, you have to go through your supply chain to be able to identify all the uses that are relevant for your customers. So that is quite an exercise, to be honest, and something that has not been done at this level in, for example, for EU REACH. It's more like authorization for EU REACH, I think. But yes, you have to go through your supply chain. And a final question, will the webinar video be available after this session? So yes, not immediately, but within some days, next week for sure. And with that, to keep this in line with our lead registration webinar, which by the way also took 1 hour and 45 minutes, we will conclude it here. Some questions I know were unanswered, but that time please feel free to contact us on this directly. You will see our contact details next. We'll be happy to help, of course, in your specific cases. So please feel free to reach out to Gagan and myself. And as I said, happy to help. And thank you very much again for your attention. And sorry for going over time. Next time I probably will just say that this will take almost 2 hours. So just so that you are prepared, even in the invitation. So thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a very great day.
Thank you, everyone.